On October 27th of 1962, a Soviet submarine known as B-59 was carrying a nuclear torpedo across the Sargasso Sea. The crew hadn't seen daylight in days and had lost all contact with Moscow. Inside, the temperature had soared past 110 degrees Fahrenheit, oxygen was running low, and the men on board were collapsing from heat and exhaustion. Then, without warning, the submarine came under attack, and explosives began detonating around the ship. The Americans were attacking them. On the surface, President John F. Kennedy had put the United States on DEFCON 2, and for the first time in history, the world was truly at the brink of nuclear war. To understand how the world got to this point, we have to go back to the end of World War II. After the war, there were two superpowers standing, the United States and the Soviet Union. While ideologically opposed, the two nations were united by a common enemy during the war. However, once Nazi Germany surrendered, this common enemy no longer existed, and the tension between the two powers started to escalate. Later, with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States established itself as the most powerful nation in the world, holding sole possession of the most devastating weapon in history up until that point, the atomic bomb, capable of destroying full cities within seconds. But that did not last. Thanks to a spy network, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, was already well aware of the nuclear bomb before the attacks. With this intelligence, the Soviets had bombs of their own by 1949. A race to create nuclear weapons began, and the Cold War began along with it. The Soviets, led by Joseph Stalin, sought to expand communism, while the US, under President Harry Truman, announced the Truman Doctrine, which promised to contain the spread of communism no matter the cost. Though both sides had the power to destroy each other, they avoided direct confrontation. Instead, they fought in proxy wars around the globe, supporting opposing forces in places like Korea, Guatemala, and Vietnam. And so this was the dynamic of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union attempted to expand, the US would retaliate by supporting Soviet enemies. And while the threat of nuclear warfare was always present, neither side directly confronted the other. This, however, was about to change. In 1953, Joseph Stalin died of a stroke, and a new kind of leader rose in his place, one more aggressive and unpredictable. His name was Nikita Khrushchev, and under his command, the Cold War would start to heat up. The world was now split in two, capitalism against communism, both sides with an understanding that the only thing that kept them from engaging in direct conflict was the nature of the weapons they held and the physical separation between the West and the East. Yet, the following decade, this physical separation was no longer as relevant, as the containment strategies that kept communism in the East failed to stop communism from taking over Cuba. In 1959, a young communist revolutionary by the name of Fidel Castro had taken over the island, and soon, the relationship between Cuba and the United States began to weaken. Then, in 1961, the United States was undergoing a transition of leadership from Dwight D. Eisenhower to John F. Kennedy. While this transition looked smooth on the outside, Kennedy had inherited a few problems. For starters, Cuba had become a very close ally of the Soviet Union during this time, potentially serving as a gateway for direct conflict, as the island is conveniently located just 90 miles away from US shores. With the Soviets gaining control and Cuba being so close to home, Kennedy was under immense pressure. On top of this, the Eisenhower administration was in the process of secretly installing mid-range nuclear ballistic missiles in Turkey and Italy, or in other words, within striking distance of Moscow, the capital of the USSR. The pieces were being moved towards nuclear war, and Kennedy had no choice but to make some extremely important moves as soon as he took office. Determined to get rid of communism in Cuba, he approved a covert CIA operation to overthrow Castro. The plan was to train Cuban exiles in Guatemala and send them back to Cuba in hopes the people would join the revolt. When the invasion began on April 17th of 1961, things quickly fell apart. The exiles landed at La Bahia de Cochinos, or Bay of Pigs, but they were vastly outnumbered. The Cuban people didn't join the revolt, and the US, trying to deny involvement, withheld air and naval support. This led to a complete failure, with all the invaders being either killed or captured within just 3 days, putting a stain on Kennedy's presidency very early on. But at this point, Kennedy's reputation was the least of anyone's concerns. Just 2 months later, he met face-to-face with Khrushchev at the Vienna summit to negotiate Cold War-related affairs. They said the meeting was tense. Khrushchev was allegedly blunt and almost taunting, implying Kennedy was weak and untested. While Kennedy might have left concerned, Khrushchev seemed particularly confident, and with this confidence, he would send Fidel Castro a dangerous proposition that Castro could not refuse. By October 16th of the following year, in Washington, Kennedy was presented with an unsettling group of photographs taken by a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. The photos revealed that missile sites were under construction in the island, and it was determined the weapons were Soviet mid-range nuclear ballistic missiles. If launched, the missiles could reach almost any point on the eastern side of the US within minutes, including Florida, New York, and even the capital, Washington, D.C. Here, everything became clear. This was a response to the missiles the US had installed in Turkey and Italy only a year prior, and after the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro had every reason to collaborate. The stage was now fully set for nuclear war. The US had nuclear missiles aimed at the Soviets, and the Soviets had nuclear missiles aimed at the US. After years of indirect conflict, the United States and the Soviet Union were finally seeing eye to eye, and if either decided to make a move, the other would immediately respond. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. With humanity at the brink of a nuclear apocalypse, Kennedy assembled DEFCON, a select group of officials that would guide him through the crisis. But this guidance turned out to make things harder. While some members of DEFCON thought it best to launch a full-scale invasion on Cuban soil and destroy the sites, others, including Kennedy, were worried that this could make things far worse. After much discussion and sleepless nights, Kennedy made a decision, and on October 22nd, he announced it on national television.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified.
The announcement shook the world. Kennedy revealed the missile sites, demanded their removal, and announced a naval blockade, carefully phrased as a quarantine to avoid framing it as an act of war. The US went to DEFCON 2 for the first time in history, military bases were fortified, and ground forces were mobilized in Florida. Across America, panic buying emptied store shelves, people built bomb shelters, ordered supplies, and prepared for the worst. Now, the world knew that the Soviet Union was considering a nuclear attack, and the United States was prepared to retaliate. However, Kennedy's plan had worked. The quarantine encouraged negotiations, and both Kennedy and Khrushchev began working out a deal. Despite the boldness of both sides, they knew no one would win a nuclear war. It was simply a lose-lose scenario for the United States, the Soviets, and humanity as a whole. In Kennedy's own words,
"Even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth."
Still, the worst was yet to come, because what no one knew at the time was that the fate of the world was no longer in the hands of Kennedy, Khrushchev, or any other world power, but instead resting silently in the hands of a rogue submarine in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. About 4 weeks earlier, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 was dispatched from the USSR along with 3 other subs as part of Nikita Khrushchev's Operation Anadyr. The mission's name referenced a cold river in the Russian Far East, misleading even the crew about their true destination. The truth, however, is that these submarines were headed to Cuba, where missile sites were already under construction. It was the perfect way for the Soviets to give the United States a taste of their own medicine, and it was a bold move, one that had to be done in secret. By the time that secret was unveiled and Kennedy announced the quarantine, the B-59 was deep in the Atlantic. But there was a problem. Communication had been lost. The crew hadn't heard from Moscow in days, and the submarine was isolated from the world. They had no knowledge of where they were truly headed, no knowledge of negotiations being underway, and no knowledge of Kennedy's announcement. What made things even more complicated is that the submarine was best equipped for cold waters, and did not perform well in the Caribbean. Hence, temperatures inside the sub were rising, and the oxygen levels were dangerously low. All factors that caused many men on board to faint. By October 27th, B-59 was moving dangerously close to the quarantine line, and American warships had been tracking it for days. Now, they began deploying signaling depth charges on the sub, meant as warning shots, but with the conditions inside the B-59, these warning shots felt like attacks. A communications specialist aboard said, "It felt like you were sitting in a metal barrel, which somebody is constantly blasting with a sledgehammer." Captain Valentin Savitsky knew about the crisis from previous communications, but had no idea of the current situation, and the attacks from above convinced him that the war had already started. He believed the only choice was to retaliate, and he prepared to launch his submarine's special ammunition, the special part being a T-5 nuclear torpedo, which, if fired, would trigger immediate American retaliation, certainly kicking off atomic warfare. A disaster that not even the countries that caused it were ready to deal with. A disaster that was now solely in the hands of an isolated crew in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. However, before kicking off the apocalypse, 3 officers had to approve the launch of the torpedo, and 2 agreed, but 1 man did not. His name was Vasily Arkhipov, the second in command aboard the B-59 and the flotilla's overall commander. Under immense pressure, he refused to authorize a strike and instead insisted they surface and await orders from Moscow. Unknowingly, Arkhipov's decision, meeting the sweltering chaos of that submarine, may have single-handedly prevented the most destructive exchange in human history. The next day, on October 28th, after days of high-stakes diplomacy, an agreement was reached. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a US pledge not to invade the island. Secretly, the US also agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy, a crucial but classified concession that would only be revealed 8 years later. Now, the crisis was over, but the fear of nuclear war would never fade. The Cold War would rage on for decades, shaping global conflicts, political ideologies, and military strategies. Still, October 27th will undoubtedly be remembered as the day we were lucky enough to not lose everything, proving that nuclear war is a game with no winners.